father demanded she move for his child, and what happened next silenced the entire plane. What would you have done in her shoes? Let us know in the comments section below. Maisie Clarke didn't look up when the girl's shadow passed over her. She had just settled into her window seat, seat 14A, and was already placing her water bottle into the narrow mesh pocket in front of her, one AirPod in and the other still clutched in her palm. She'd boarded early thanks to a seat upgrade she didn't expect but deeply appreciated. That was her little win of the day. She didn't ask for much. A window view, a quiet flight, and a few hours to herself. That was it. The girl, no more than 8 or 9, lingered in the aisle beside her, wide eyes blinking fast behind pink-framed glasses. Her chest rose and fell like she'd just run through the terminal. "Excuse me," came the man's voice behind her, sharp with the kind of entitlement that made Maisie's jaw tense before she even turned. She glanced up. The man had sandy blonde hair combed with gel and a suit that looked slept-in but still expensive. He placed a hand on the girl's shoulder like he was announcing ownership. His expression was one Maisie had seen before. Measured smile, tight eyes. As if he was trying very hard not to appear impolite, while knowing he didn't have to be. "I was wondering if you'd be willing to switch with my daughter," he said, gesturing vaguely down the aisle. "She's a nervous flyer. First time traveling without her mother. She needs the window to feel grounded." Maisie blinked. "Where's the other seat?" "Middle. Back there," he said. "Row 23. Maisie smiled, but not with her mouth, more like with her eyes. Flat. Unreadable. "That's not equivalent." "It's a seat," he said, a flicker of irritation beneath his voice now. "You look young. I'm sure you can handle the middle." The girl clutched a stuffed bunny to her chest and said nothing. She never made eye contact with Maisie. That told her everything. This wasn't the girl's idea. Maisie turned slightly, offering a polite shake of her head. "I paid extra for this seat. I'd like to keep it." The air cooled between them, like someone had flipped a switch. "I'm sorry," the man said, his voice still low but edged now with judgment. "I thought you'd be more understanding. My daughter is clearly anxious." Maisie nodded slowly. "I'm not unsympathetic. I just don't want to give up my seat." A woman in the next row turned her head slightly, listening. Maisie could feel the shift. That moment when a private conversation becomes a public performance. The man leaned forward closer than was necessary. "You're seriously going to say no to a child?" Maisie turned her face to the window, breathing through the instant burn that flushed the back of her neck. She'd been here before. Not in seat 14A, not on this exact flight, but in this exact scenario. Expected to shrink, to yield, because someone else believed they were more deserving of comfort. A flight attendant passed by, paused. "Everything all right here?" she asked, her badge glinting. "Tessa." The man straightened. "We're having a bit of an issue. My daughter's frightened of flying. This woman has the window seat. I asked if she could move so my daughter could feel safer." Maisie opened her mouth to speak, but the man cut in before she could. "She refused," he said, "and frankly, I'm shocked. I thought maybe you could help encourage her." Tessa looked from the man to the girl, then to Maisie. "Miss, is that true?" Maisie met her eyes, calm and quiet. "Yes. He asked, and I said no. I paid for this seat. I'd like to stay in it." The flight attendant's eyes softened just a bit. She didn't say anything right away. That silence said more than words. The girl was now looking down at her shoes, bunny crushed to her chest. Tessa cleared her throat. "Sir, you and your daughter are welcome to take your assigned seats. We can't force other passengers to move." The man's jaw ticked. "So you're not even going to try? She's a child." Tessa's posture didn't shift. "She's not in danger, sir. If the seat is that important, we can check for any open windows after boarding finishes." "She needs it now," he snapped. Maisie flinched, not because of the volume, but because she saw the girl's shoulders jump too. The moment cracked. "You can't be serious," he muttered, shaking his head. "This is what's wrong with people now. No decency, no kindness." Maisie turned her head again, finally facing him. "Kindness isn't the same as compliance. I'm not being unkind, I'm just saying no." People were watching now. Tessa seemed to notice too. "Sir," she said, firmer this time, "we need to keep the aisle clear." "She's being unreasonable," he barked. Tessa lifted a hand calmly. "She's sitting in her assigned seat." The man looked down at his daughter, then back at Maisie. "I hope you feel good about yourself." Maisie's mouth twitched. Not a smile. Not quite. Just restraint. "I do," she said simply, turning back toward the window. The man lingered for a second more before huffing loudly and moving down the aisle with his daughter trailing behind him. Someone a few rows back gave a slow clap that was quickly hushed. It wasn't meant to be funny, just supportive, quietly defiant. Maisie adjusted her seatbelt, took a breath, and put in her second AirPod. She closed her eyes. But she could still feel the charge in the air, the kind that doesn't just go away. From the corner of her eye, she saw Tessa crouch slightly beside her. "You did nothing wrong," she said in a low voice, "just so you know." Maisie opened one eye, grateful. "Thanks." Tessa smiled. "If he tries anything else, press your call button." Maisie nodded. The attendant stood and moved on. Her words echoed anyway. The plane hadn't even taken off yet, and already Maisie was exhausted. But for once, she didn't feel small. The wheels of the plane hadn't even left the ground, and already Maisie felt like she'd run a marathon, not physically, but in the way her body felt wound too tight, like a rubber band stretched just shy of snapping. She kept her eyes closed, not to sleep, but to shield herself. Not from Gregory Langston. She knew his name now thanks to the loud complaints he was already voicing to anyone who'd listen, but from the tension that was swelling seat by seat, aisle by aisle. The seat beside her was still empty. That gave her a small pocket of air, a space to breathe without someone else's elbows in her ribs. It wouldn't last long, but for the moment she took it. "Hey," came a voice, soft and a little gravelly, like it belonged to someone used to being listened to but not used to raising it. Maisie opened her eyes to see an older man standing just in the aisle beside her row. His white hair curled at the ears, and his face had the kind of lines that only came from years of smiling and worrying in equal measure. "I think I'm your neighbor," he said, holding up his boarding pass like proof. She moved her legs to let him through, offering a quiet nod. He slid into the middle seat with a grunt and an audible crack from his knees. Once settled, he looked over at her. Hell of a way to start a flight. Maisie didn't respond at first. She wasn't sure if he was trying to make conversation or choose a side. "Didn't think just sitting in your seat could cause a scene," she said finally, her tone light but tired. The man chuckled, not unkindly. "People love a cause, especially when it ain't theirs." Maisie looked at him for a beat longer before returning her gaze to the window. Outside, baggage carts moved like toys across the tarmac. A family with 3 kids rushed up to the jet bridge. The sky was clear, but her chest still felt heavy. "I'm Henry," he said after a pause. "Henry McClure. Retired mostly. Used to teach middle school. History." Maisie offered a half-smile. "Maisie Clarke. I plan events for a nonprofit, mostly fundraising." "Good work," he said with a nod. "We need more people doing good." Another beat. "You did the right thing, by the way," he added. Maisie raised an eyebrow. "There's a right thing? In this case? Yeah, it's called boundaries." Maisie let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though it caught in her throat halfway out. She wasn't used to being believed so quickly. Most of the time, standing your ground meant being labeled difficult, uncooperative, or, her personal favorite, aggressive. The intercom crackled to life, and the flight attendants began their safety demonstration, Tessa was up front, gesturing calmly, her expression unreadable. Maisie watched her for a moment, wondering how many times the woman had to perform that same routine while simultaneously managing passengers like Gregory. She imagined it took a different kind of strength, one that didn't always get recognized. As the plane began to taxi, Gregory's voice echoed faintly from a few rows back. He wasn't yelling, not yet, but he was speaking just loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear his opinions on entitlement and basic courtesy. It was clear who he was talking about, even without her name. Maisie felt Henry shift beside her. He didn't say anything, but she caught the subtle tightening of his jaw. Gregory was still talking, not to the flight attendants anymore, but to the man seated next to him, some tired-looking guy in noise-canceling headphones who clearly didn't ask for a monologue. Maisie recognized the tactic. It wasn't just about the seat anymore. Gregory wanted an audience. He wanted validation. He wanted someone to affirm that he was right and that the woman who said no to him had done something wrong. The plane lifted off, and Maisie felt the familiar lurch in her stomach, followed by the soft pressure that came with altitude. The city shrank below them, cars becoming ants, roads becoming veins. She leaned slightly into the window, letting the cool press of glass against her temple remind her that she was here, still in her seat, still holding the line. After a while, Henry spoke again. "May I ask you something personal?" Maisie hesitated, then nodded. "Shh. And why didn't you move?" She considered the question, the weight behind it. It wasn't accusatory, it was curious, like a man who'd seen too much of the world to assume everything was simple. "I think I just didn't want to give in to someone who assumed I would," she said finally. "It wasn't even about the seat, not really." Henry nodded slowly. "That makes sense." Maisie looked down at her hands. Her nails were painted a muted lavender, chipped at the edges. She hadn't had time to redo them before the trip. "People like him," she continued, "they don't hear no very often, especially not from women like me." Henry didn't flinch at that, didn't deflect. He just looked at her with the kind of quiet understanding that didn't need to be spoken aloud. "You're not wrong," he said, "but maybe you made him hear it today." Maisie didn't say anything, but her chest loosened just a little. Time passed in a strange way on airplanes, half fast, half frozen. A flight attendant came by with drinks. Maisie asked for ginger ale. Henry took coffee, black. The girl, Gregory's daughter, passed their row on the way to the bathroom. Her bunny dragged slightly on the floor behind her. She didn't look up. Maisie didn't blame her. She didn't hate the kid. She hated the way her father used her, turned her anxiety into a weapon, held her up like a shield. She closed her eyes again, not to sleep, but to reclaim the space inside her own head. When she opened them, the girl was passing back to her seat, head still down. A note appeared in her lap 20 minutes later, folded in half with handwriting that looked like it belonged to someone used to cursive but forced into print. It read, "Sorry my dad was mean. I'm okay. I just wanted to sit by the window, but he told me I should ask loud. I didn't want to bother you." There was no name, just a heart drawn in the corner. Maisie folded it gently and tucked it into the sleeve of her journal. She didn't smile, not really, but something in her chest softened. Henry noticed, but didn't ask. He didn't need to. The flight would land in 2 hours. Gregory Langston would still be on the plane. The other passengers would still remember what happened. But so would she. And this time she wouldn't remember it as a loss. She'd remember it as a beginning. The plane had reached cruising altitude, but nothing felt settled. The hum of the engines and the quiet rustle of magazines and drink cups couldn't drown out the aftershock of the earlier standoff. Maisie could feel it, still clinging to her skin like static. Every now and then a passenger glanced her way, some curious, others neutral, but none brave enough to meet her eyes for more than a second. The cabin wasn't hostile, just aware. Maisie wasn't used to that kind of visibility. Her job required her to be the organizer, not the centerpiece. She liked working behind the scenes, blending in when she chose to, but now she was unmistakably the woman in 14A. And Gregory Langston, with all his practiced condescension, had made sure of that. From his spot in row 23, he had taken on a new role, narrator of the injustice he believed he'd suffered. Maisie couldn't hear every word, but the bits that filtered forward made her stomach turn. Words like selfish, unreasonable, zero empathy. He wasn't shouting, just speaking with the kind of volume people use when they want to be overheard without being accused of making a scene. Every dig he threw was dipped in plausible deniability. Maisie didn't respond. Not because she was afraid, at least not in the way Gregory probably assumed. She wasn't shrinking. She was waiting. Tessa, the flight attendant, passed by again, this time with a tray of pretzels and water. When she reached Maisie's row, she gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, as if to say, "I haven't forgotten." Maisie accepted a cup and packet, gave a small nod in return, and kept her gaze forward. She didn't need more words, just space. "You know," Henry murmured beside her, unwrapping his pretzels. "He's not the first man I've seen unravel at 30,000 feet. But he might be the most boring." Maisie snorted into her ginger ale. Henry smiled. "Some people can't handle not being the center of gravity. He probably goes through life thinking gravity bends for him." "People usually do," she said, "when the world keeps confirming it." Henry tilted his head, considering. "You're not wrong." Maisie leaned back, closed her eyes again for a moment, but this time not to disappear, just to be. A few rows back, Gregory's voice rose slightly. "Just think, some people need to be reminded they're not the only ones on the flight. Basic decency. That's all." Maisie didn't turn around, but Tessa did. From across the aisle, she fixed her gaze on him. "Sir," she said, her voice even but edged, "if you continue disturbing passengers, I'll have to file an incident report." The air in the cabin shifted, subtle but sharp. Gregory scoffed. "So now I'm disturbing people for speaking the truth?" "The captain has already been informed of the earlier interaction. I'd advise you to take the time to relax, sir." For a beat, nothing happened. The whole plane held its breath. Then Gregory slumped back in his seat, his lips pressed into a line. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. His silence was full of bitterness. Henry leaned over to Maisie. "She's good, that one." Maisie smiled without showing her teeth. "Yeah, she really is." The girl, Lily, if Maisie remembered correctly, was quiet now too. Maisie caught glimpses of her reflection in the window when she shifted, a small figure tucked into a too-big seat, hugging her bunny like it was armor. Maisie couldn't hate her. Even if part of her wanted to, it wasn't fair. Kids didn't get to choose the people who shaped them. After a while, the cabin grew more relaxed. The seatbelt sign blinked off. A baby started crying somewhere near the back, and someone laughed softly at a rom-com playing on the seat monitor. The tension didn't vanish, but it faded, like thunder after a storm. Still present, still heavy in the sky, but quieter. Maisie pulled out her journal from the seat-back pocket. She wasn't going to write, not yet. But the act of holding it made her feel like herself again. She flipped through old pages, notes from past events she'd organized, names, quotes, sketches of seating charts. It was full of other people's moments, which somehow made it easier to hold on to her own. Henry peeked over. "You write?" Maisie nodded. "Mostly ideas, things I hear, things I don't want to forget." "Ah," he said, eyes twinkling. "A catcher of moments." Maisie liked that. Before she could respond, Tessa reappeared. "Miss Clarke?" she asked quietly. Maisie looked up. "The captain would like a word with you, if you're okay with that." Maisie blinked. "Am I in trouble?" Tessa smiled. "Not at all." Henry raised an eyebrow as Maisie unbuckled and stood. The aisle felt longer than it had earlier. As she walked past rows of strangers, she tried not to notice the looks. Not hostile, just curious, maybe even approving. That was its own kind of pressure. The cockpit door was closed when she arrived. Tessa knocked once, waited, and then opened it. Captain Alina Moore turned in her seat. She was in her late 40s, maybe older, with a calm presence that felt earned, not performed. Her dark brown hair was pinned back neatly beneath her cap. "Maisie, right?" the captain asked. Maisie nodded, suddenly aware of how tightly she was holding her journal. "Come in, if you're comfortable. Door stays open, of course." Maisie stepped in. "I just wanted to say thank you," Captain Moore said. "Tessa briefed me. We don't always get the full story when something escalates, but in this case it was clear." Maisie swallowed. "I just didn't want to move." "You didn't have to," the captain said. "You weren't wrong. You didn't raise your voice. You didn't disrupt. You just said no, and that made someone else uncomfortable." Maisie didn't expect it to feel like this, being believed. It wasn't loud or triumphant. It was quiet, steadying. "We've got your back," the captain added. "If Mr. Langston escalates, we'll reroute security when we land. Just a heads up." Maisie blinked. "Security?" "Standard. If someone's combative or attempts to rally other passengers mid-light, we have to document it." Maisie nodded slowly. "Thank you." The captain gave a small nod. "You're not the problem here. Just remember that." Maisie stepped back into the aisle, feeling strangely taller. As she made her way back to her seat, she didn't try to shrink, didn't avert her eyes. If anything, she moved with a kind of quiet certainty, one that no longer felt borrowed. Henry was waiting with a raised brow and a grin. "You're not going to get us all kicked off, are you?" he teased. Maisie chuckled. "Not unless someone gives me a reason." They sat in silence for a few moments, side by side, the way people do when the worst part of something is behind them, and all that's left is the steady hum of survival. Maisie finally opened her journal. She didn't need to write the moment down. She was already living in it. The seatbelt light blinked on with a soft chime, signaling the beginning of descent. Outside the window, the clouds had thinned, and the golden light of late afternoon spilled across the wings like melted honey. Maisie looked out over the patchwork of tiny houses and winding roads. Her reflection ghosted faintly on the glass. This was the part she always loved, watching the world come back into focus, the illusion of floating stripped away, the return to something solid. Henry shifted in his seat beside her, folding up his crossword puzzle with the kind of satisfaction that came from finishing every square. "You good?" he asked, voice gentle but clear. Maisie nodded. "Yeah, I think I am." The moment was quiet, almost peaceful, until a harsh cough sliced through the air behind them. "Gregory Langston." Again. "I just don't understand what this flight crew is even doing," he muttered loudly to the man beside him, who had long since abandoned all hope of a relaxing trip. "We live in a society where people used to have respect, courtesy. Now it's just everyone for themselves." Maisie didn't turn around this time. She didn't need to. Instead, she adjusted her tray table, calmly returned her journal to her bag, and sat up straighter. Not in defiance, just in readiness. "Think he'll still be talking when we hit the runway?" Henry whispered with a sly grin. Maisie laughed under her breath. "He'll still be talking when we're at baggage claim, possibly through customs, maybe even in the afterlife." The laughter felt good, unforced, warm. She hadn't realized how tightly she'd been holding herself until the tension finally eased. As the wheels dropped with a soft mechanical thump, a murmur of motion passed through the cabin. Passengers straightened up, bags were zipped, cell phones came alive again like waking animals. And then Tessa reappeared. She moved with quiet authority, a folded sheet of paper in hand. Stopping just beside row 14, she crouched a little, enough to be eye level with Maisie. "Captain just finalized everything," she said softly. "Security will be meeting the aircraft once we land. We'll escort you through the side gate just so you don't have to deal with any fallout in the terminal." Maisie blinked. "Fallout?" Tessa gave a small smile. "Just precaution. You were calm, but Mr. Langston? Not so much. He's been on the crew's radar since boarding." Maisie glanced around, her voice low. "He didn't touch me. He didn't even really yell." "No," Tessa said, "but sometimes it's not about what someone does. It's about what they try to make others feel. And he was trying really hard to make you feel small. You didn't let him. That matters." Maisie felt the sting of unexpected emotion behind her eyes. Not sadness, not fear, just recognition. Tessa stood. "We've got you. All the way through." When the plane finally touched down with a smooth rumble of rubber against tarmac, the entire cabin exhaled in unison. The quiet applause that followed was half habit, half relief. The intercom buzzed to life. "Ladies and gentlemen," came Captain Moore's voice, clear and firm. "Welcome to Charlotte. We'll be taxiing shortly. Please remain seated until the seatbelt sign is turned off. Thank you again for flying with us." As the plane rolled toward the gate, Maisie felt something shift inside her. Something subtle but powerful, like a stone that had been sitting heavy on her chest finally lifted. She didn't just make it through, she came through intact. When the plane stopped, the usual chaos of landing took over. People standing too early, overhead bins creaking, the awkward dance of retrieving bags while pretending not to bump into each other. But Tessa was already making her way back to row 14. "Miss Clarke, if you don't mind staying seated a moment, we'll escort you out last." Maisie nodded, grateful for the buffer. Gregory, of course, did not go quietly. "I don't understand why she's getting special treatment," he said, rising with an exaggerated groan. "Is this what we do now? Reward bad behavior?" Tessa turned sharply, her expression crisp. "Sir, I'd advise you to focus on collecting your belongings." Gregory narrowed his eyes but said nothing more. Maisie could see the tight line of his jaw as he tugged his bag from the bin and herded his daughter ahead of him. Lily glanced back once. A flicker of something passed between her and Maisie. Uncertainty, apology, or maybe just confusion. Maisie gave her a nod, soft and small. The girl turned and disappeared down the aisle. As the last few passengers cleared out, Captain Moore appeared at the front of the cabin, speaking briefly with Tessa before approaching Maisie directly. "Ms. Clarke," she said, extending a hand. "Pleasure to meet you in person. Thank you for your composure today." Maisie shook her hand, surprised by the firm warmth of it. "I didn't really do anything." "You did more than most would," Captain Moore replied, "and that matters." They guided her down the jet bridge, not like someone under surveillance, but someone being protected. At the base of the bridge, 2 airport security officers stood waiting, not looking for trouble, just stationed, just present. They nodded respectfully as Maisie passed. Outside, the filtered light of late afternoon touched everything in gold. The terminal buzzed with life. Families reuniting, drivers with name signs, announcements echoing from unseen speakers. Maisie paused just before the sliding doors. Tessa caught up beside her. "Where are you headed next?" "Hotel tonight," Maisie said, "then home. Just a short trip, family stuff." "Well, I hope they know they raised a force of nature," Tessa said with a wink. Maisie laughed. "I don't know about that." "I do," Tessa replied. "Take care of yourself." They parted there. No big farewell. Just a nod. A thank you. A mutual knowing. Maisie stepped through the doors, the warm air brushing against her skin like a welcome. Outside, the world was the same. But she was not. As she waited at the rideshare curb, she took out her phone and tapped open a note she'd started weeks ago, a piece she hadn't yet finished. A story she hadn't figured out how to tell. Now she knew. She scrolled to the bottom and typed. They never expected her to say no. That's what made it powerful. Then she closed her phone, slid it into her bag, and smiled. A silver sedan pulled up with her name glowing on the dash. The driver waved. Maisie stepped forward, suitcase rolling behind her. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She had stood her ground, and the world kept moving. But this time, it moved around her.